Fackler. I'm 17 years old and I'm a junior at South Oldham High School in Crestwood, Kentucky. I'm also a member of COSAIR Charities Face It to End Child Abuse in Kentucky. Today I have the honor and privilege to introduce you a key member of our state government, Secretary of State Michael Adams, who is a native of Paducah and a graduate of both the University of Louisville and Harvard Law School. As an attorney, Adams practiced election law, and in 2019 he was elected to serve as Kentucky's chief election official. Once inaugurated as Secretary of State on January 6, 2020, Adams pushed his highest legislative priority, which is Kentucky's first photo ID to vote law. Despite challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, he succeeded in making elections easier for Kentuckians to vote, eliminating the potential for voter fraud. As an organization, KYA values the immense need for advocacy for today's youth in our democracy. Secretary Adams has shown his value in advocacy through his bipartisan work with Governor Beshear to achieve record voter turnout despite the current global pandemic. As we all know, exercising our right to vote is the foundation of our democracy and a valuable necessity for advocacy. Through Kentucky's successful voting system, organized by Secretary Adams, we can ensure the opportunity to advocate for generations to come. That's why I'm honored to introduce Secretary of State Michael Adams. Then we'll go over to Jessie Whitish right now.
Hey everyone, thank you Hunter, and thank you to all of the advocates who are joining us today. I am Jessie Whitish, Chief Engagement Officer at Kentucky Youth Advocates, and I am fangirling just a little bit to be here with Secretary of State Michael Adams, because I, like many of you who may be on today's Zoom, am a huge fan of, democracy, our Constitution, how voting works. So I'm really honored to be joined with our Secretary of State. He's our Chief Election Officer. He's also a self-described Chief Election nerd. I believe I read that in an official statement from your office, Secretary. And from one nerd to another, thank you for joining us today. And I'm really excited about this conversation because I know you have been very public about, you're going to have to, push for things that make half the people happy, half the people unhappy. And we've heard this week about the importance of talking with people, with legislators, with decision makers who you may not agree with all the time, but just how important it is to have those relationships. So I'm excited because I agree with you half the time, I disagree with you half the time. And so yeah, thank you for being here. We're thrilled.
Well, thank you so much. This flag behind me is a good reminder. You've got two people who come from different backgrounds, totally different socioeconomic and regional backgrounds, and they're working together, they're shaking hands. And so I think about that every day.
Absolutely, and I think you've done a good job along with state leaders of both parties in trying to navigate a lot of difficult situations in your little over a year in office to really bring both sides of the aisle and folks who maybe are unlikely allies together. So I just want to kick things off, and elections are, for better or worse, particularly high profile right now. Political rhetoric, I think we could say, is a little high right now. And here we are during Children's Advocacy Week. This is the last day of Children's Advocacy Week. We're talking about common ground for kids. We're talking about advocacy on behalf of kids. So can you talk a little bit about the link between, voting and elections and policy change? Like, why is our conversation today so important to advocates?
Well, there are several ways, of course, to try to advocate for your position. One of them is to come here to Frankfurt and protest or meet with legislators or so forth. Of course, that's a lot harder to do right now in a pandemic. The best, or you can send letters, you can email, but the bottom line is the best way to be heard is to literally be heard, is to go vote. That's why it's so important. That's why I've dedicated my career to these issues. I think it's really important. I grew up in a family of the other major political party than the one I belong to, and I pushed them to go vote every year, even though they were voting against the people I was for, because everyone ought to be heard. decide what your position is and then go out there and advocate for it. And it's not just limited to voting. I think it's a bigger call of citizenship than just voting, but voting is a good start with it. And I'm really proud that we saw last year, despite the pandemic, a record turnout. We had 65% of voters go vote, the highest we've seen in modern times, the highest time certainly this millennium, in the midst of a pandemic. People are riled up. That's a good thing. It motivates them to go out there and be heard. That's a good thing for all of us.
Absolutely, that like enthusiasm for what you believe in and enthusiasm for the change that you want to see, like you said, even if maybe there's kind of different results that you're hoping from there. Can you tell us just a little bit more? You mentioned that, you know, you grew up in a family of an opposite political party than what you are right now. Just thinking about some of the kids who may be joining this or watching this recording, can you tell us a little bit about like what lit the fire in your belly as a kid to then grow up to be Secretary of State?
Well, it's a little embarrassing, but yeah, I grew up in an extremely conservative, not politically conservative, but extremely conservative home, and I wasn't allowed to watch TV for the most part. The only things I could watch were American movie classics. This is before Breaking Bad and so forth. It was just Betty Grable movies. I could watch that, or I could watch C-SPAN, because there wasn't going to be any bad language or adult situations or so forth. So between those choices, I had to watch C-SPAN. So I watched a lot of C-SPAN when I was 11, 12, 13 years old, and I got really interested in Congress and in government and so forth. And it lit an interest in me, and it exposed me to it at a young age. And so by the time I was old enough to vote, I was already professionally running campaigns.
That's really impressive. And a note to everyone watching today: turn on C-SPAN for your kids, and perhaps they will take this path. So if we can think about that idea of common ground and bipartisan efforts that we were touching on at the beginning, you and the governor, I think, have been such a great example, not only for Kentuckians, but a national example of how, like, bipartisan cooperation, you know, how everybody can come together, work together on a really kind of what could have been a disaster, frankly, in terms of an election. So, you know that you're publicly making decisions that even during that made some people happy, made some people not so happy. So what encouragement would you offer to not only the advocates who are watching today, but also maybe even to our other state leaders in terms of that working together, and maybe even like personally, kind of what did that feel like for you?
It was really hard. It wasn't actually hard to do. It was obviously the right thing to do, but it was politically really hard. About half the opposition that I got from within my party was on the substance of what I did, and I respect that. But the other half was, how could you work with that guy? He's on the other side. I think that's a really foolish way to do your job. You can't limit yourself to only working with the people that you agree with. Otherwise, we can't get anything done. I've got a constitutionally weak position. I don't have a great deal of authority. The only way I can get stuff done is to work with other people and get them to cooperate with me. I have to get the legislature to help me. I have to get the governor to help me. I have to help them as well. So the first step is just to not demonize the other side. The governor and I disagree sometimes, but we never attack each other personally. He's never attacked me. I've never attacked him. We disagree, and that's fine. We're elected to. People split their tickets. They voted for him and they voted for me, and I work for his voters and he works for my voters. You can't get dug in with this sort of demonization of the other side or of those who work with the other side. And that's unfortunately what you're really seeing in today's politics, is that kind of polarization where you're either with us or you're with them. Well, I don't just work for one side. I got elected to serve in a statewide office. I got to work for everybody, not just the 44% of voters who registered Republicans.
Yeah, one of the best quotes that I've heard about serving in elected office was actually from former state representative and former Justice Secretary John Tilley. who, you know, worked a lot across the aisle with Republicans, the Democrat, and then was the only Democrat serving in former Governor Bevin's cabinet. And during one of our advocate virtual forums we had kind of during election season, he said the best way to serve in office is to be willing to lose it. And that was a really, I was like, wow, that must be so scary to be like, oh yeah, I know I'm going to do things that may, yeah, and you know, in a country where we have kind of two dominant parties, maybe upset half, you know, a chunk of your party or whatever that is. So
yeah, I think that's universally true. I'll tell you, it's especially true of my job, because people across the spectrum have to believe that the election official's fair, because we can't have a functioning democracy if people think that I'm a hack for one side or the other. They won't vote. They'll think that the system is rigged. So to me, it was really important to avoid the mistakes that some other states made. I'll give you some specific examples. In Ohio and Wisconsin, you had partisan disagreements about what the election was going to look like. You had lawsuits, you had brinksmanship. And what happened in Ohio was the election was on, then it was called off, and it was back on again. People got confused. They didn't know when the election was going to be, and they didn't vote. In Wisconsin, a similar situation. They sued each other back and forth, the governor and the Republicans in the legislature, and it went to the Supreme Court to make up the election rules the night before Election Day. It's not just a matter of being nice to each other and acting professional. It's also, if you don't do that, your system won't work. The public won't have confidence in you. They won't even know what the rules are. The only way to have a clean and fair election is to put your partisanship aside and just figure it out.
There's that real transparency too, in that I think you and the governor both showed during that whole time of having to, you know, kind of be really open and honest with, frankly, some challenges. You know, like, here's what happened in the primary. If we do that again, we could have a problem. You know, like I think that was also something that was really interesting to watch you all kind of process that in the public eye. So I don't know how that was. Yeah.
We tried to be transparent about what we were thinking. He took a position, I took a different position, and we worked out something kind of in the middle. And I think it was important for us to sort of debate it a little bit publicly, so people saw that both sides were being listened to, both sides were at the table, and then we compromised. And that's, unfortunately, compromise is kind of a dirty word in today's politics. Everybody wants to run the table on their side, but we wouldn't even have a constitution if it weren't for compromise. The reason we have a constitution today is because you had the northern states and southern states agree to work it out. And otherwise, we wouldn't have a country today. So you got to have compromise. You know, fight it out, that's fine, that's what the elections are for, but then work together where you can.
That's such an interesting perspective, to be like, not that our country was built on ideology, but that our country was built on compromise. So I'm going to save that for later and quote you some other time with that, because I think that's a really important point. So last time we talked with you, last time we had you on one of our forums here at Kentucky Youth Advocates, I think it was September 2nd. So it was like the heat of that general election prep. Like, you, I think, actually had on your desk like the county voting plans. You were like, here's one, it's like 100 pages of, you know, of stuff.
Each, yeah.
120 of those, right? You had to go through 120 of those?
Yeah.
So now we're like 3 months post-election. So you've given some reflections, but do you want to share any more reflections on that, like, tremendous effort, that tremendous bipartisan effort? Also, you know, all the polling, volunteer, all of that, maybe not only in the immediate, but now that you've had a few months to look back on that?
Yeah, so first off, I want to thank all our county clerks, our poll workers, and our voters for making this election so smooth and successful. One person in the Capitol can't do that. It took thousands and thousands of poll workers and millions of voters social distancing and masking and following the rules to make this a successful election. I'm really proud that we had not just a successful high turnout election where people who wanted to vote got to vote. It's never been easier in 200 years to vote than it was in 2020. you add that to the fact that we had a safe election, that we didn't see a spike in COVID cases, which was, of course, a real concern we had. We had 2 million people vote, over 2 million vote, and about 1.5 million of them voted in person. But because we spread that out over a period of time, several weeks, we were able to avoid the crowds. And so I'm really proud that obviously we saw COVID spikes coming out of the holidays, New Year's Eve, Christmas, and Thanksgiving, 4th of July for that matter. We were real concerned about a COVID spike coming out of the election. We didn't really see that. I think that's really the thing I'm the proudest of. I'm also really proud that we had a fair election without vote fraud. A lot of folks were predicting we were going to have this mass vote fraud because of all the expansion of access to the ballot that we provided, but it just didn't materialize. And that's partly because some of those theories were oversold, but it's partly because we also had new security mechanisms in place to prevent that from ever happening. The absentee ballot portal, for one, it made access a lot easier for the voters, but also enabled us to monitor the system and make sure that these ballots weren't being lost or stolen. So there's a lot of reforms that we made that I think were really popular, worked really well, and I'm going to try to make them permanent. I'll tell you what those are real fast. There's a bill that is actually being drafted as we speak. I'm hoping to have it introduced next week publicly for public comment, hopefully hearings and passage in the legislature. There's 4 key points of what we did that I want to keep permanently. One is early voting. Voters loved it. Voters of both parties, rural voters, urban voters. Everyone likes voting who's a voter, and they want it to be as easy as they can make it. There's our election system that I inherited has been on our books since 1891. It's never really been revisited. It was written for an agrarian time before modern reality. People's lives are just different today than they were in 1891. It's been 130 years. We need to catch up to the rest of the country. One of the ways we can do that is expanding access to the ballot, making it easier to vote. Instead of making everyone vote on one day in a 12-hour span, give them several days. I don't know what our final package is going to be. We've got some strategic decisions to make. It might be 3 days. It might be a week. It might be even longer than that. I don't think that we can probably get more than a few days through the Senate. So I think that's where we'll end up. But in any event, we need more days to go vote. I also want to allow the counties to keep these supercenter models of voting. You can get voters in and out much faster with a supercenter than you can with a traditional precinct model. I'm not going to advocate that we close all the precincts, but I want to be able to authorize the counties to offer supercenters because they're more convenient for the voters, and they're also a lot cheaper to operate than the old model. I want to keep the absentee ballot request portal. As I said, it makes it easier for the voter to get the ballot, but also makes it easier for the election officials to track it and make sure that it's delivered and that the vote counts. It also lets the voter track the ballot the way she would track a UPS or an Amazon package. And finally, the cure process. For the very first time in Kentucky, the voters whose absentee ballots had an issue were contacted and informed that there was an issue so they could come back and fix it. We threw out 7.5% of the absentee votes in 2018, the last election before 2020. They never even told the voters. The clerks just threw the ballots in the garbage.
Wow.
This time, we informed the voters. And even though we expanded absentee voting, we had way more absentee ballots coming in. We cut the fail rate in half in the primary from 7.5% to 3.8%, and then to less than 1% in the general, despite so many more ballots, because we actually reached out to the voters and said, hey, help us fix this problem so we can count your vote. Those are the 4 big points of what I think needs to be in this package. And the consensus, I've been meeting with Democrats and Republicans, county clerks, legislators, everybody else, stakeholders across the board to try to get buy-in from everybody. Because what I really want is a bipartisan package. You can't have election laws made by one side or the other. The other side then won't trust it. You got to have everybody at the table.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's so, when you talk about those kind of, I mean, frankly, like you said the word, I think, but like they're modernization efforts. It's bringing all of those laws, or all of those practices into the 21st century. And that should be something that, folks are getting behind, right? But yes, we should actually make it easy for people to come and vote. I'd like to ask a follow-up on another, I think, great thing from the 2020 election, which was your recruitment of poll workers. I know I personally have never walked into a precinct and seen a poll worker who was by my estimation, under the age of 70. Shout out to all of those poll workers who have been around for a long time. But then, like this year, two of our staff members here at a pretty small staff, they volunteered to be poll workers. Can you comment on how maybe you're hoping to kind of see some of that continuity? Because I think that's another interesting way that advocates who are on this Zoom can be involved in making change. Like, poll workers are so vital in making elections happen.
Well, obviously I want everybody to vote, but that's just the beginning. I also want people to be more engaged civically in other respects, through nonprofits, through volunteering as poll workers or what have you. Let me give you some statistics. I testified in the legislature before I was even sworn in. 2 weeks after I got elected, I was invited to testify, and I told the legislature we had a crisis with our poll workers, so we weren't going to have enough. And that was before the pandemic. The reason being, it takes about 15,000 poll workers statewide to run a Kentucky election. We went from needing 15,000 to only having about 2,000 volunteers in our primary last year. Again, it's hard enough to get 15,000 in a normal year, and then you add COVID to it. You add to the fact that most of our poll workers are senior citizens. They just evaporate overnight. It wasn't just the poll workers disappearing, it was the locations canceling on us. Most of our locations are not government buildings, and so they don't have to be polling locations. And so this really, it was a crisis, but there was an opportunity there to sort of re-examine how we do this. We're going to have poll workers. You can't have elections without poll workers. Something that we did was we reached out to different communities. We made a point that we just can't rely on only senior citizens for obvious reasons in a pandemic to stand up and be our poll workers. So we pushed younger generations to volunteer. I'm a Gen Xer, I'm 44. I tried to get people my age to go register and be poll workers. So we thought about, well, how do we reach out to those people? We reached out through the State Bar Association. We reached out actually through the Kentucky Guild of Craft Brewers for them to put PSA logos on their beer cans and bottles. It was called, our campaign was called SOS from your SOS. And it had a link you could click on to a portal to volunteer to be a poll worker. Our portal by itself found 5,000 poll workers. And so that didn't go to 15, but it really helped us meet some of the demand going into November. And one of the reasons we had a lot more locations to vote in person in November than we had in June was that we had more volunteers. But it can't just be a one-time thing. It's got to be something that people do regularly. Most of our poll workers that we've had, they do it every single election, twice a year. I got to get people who are younger to do that too, to volunteer on a regular basis. It's a real challenge.
Well, hopefully everybody who took up the mantle during the last election will keep that up, and more of us. I believe I'm what they call a zennial. Like I'm a few years younger than you, not quite a millennial. That I can rally some of my friends and we can go be poll workers too, because it's such a, like you're saying, that's just one, voting is just one piece of election success. So I'll see what I can do for you, and we'll have everybody, all the advocates who are listening to this, round up your friends and let's all go be poll workers together during our next election. We're not having another one, and we have an election in 2021, or we get to take a break.
You get a year off this year.
Okay. By 2022, let's all get ourselves together and be out there in the primary. So, so some of the measures that you were talking about during the 2020 election, what the early voting and the voting, like expanding voting by mail and all of that stuff, that really leads us to a conversation about equity. Kentucky Youth Advocates and the Blueprint for Kentucky's Children, which is our statewide coalition of more than 100 partner organizations who are out there on behalf of kids and families working for better policies. This year, we are really trying to take a more active role in asking state leaders to discuss systemic racism and ways to address systemic racism, opportunities to increase equity for not only the kids but also their families, which I think is probably relevant as you're talking, probably more like parents that are voting than the kids that are voting right now. So within the scope of voting and voting access, how is your office trying to either whether that's enfranchise or better reach out to people of color, communities of color, to advance equity?
Well, that was one of the real challenges we had last year. Developing the policy and implementing it. Those were administrative challenges. But I'd say the hardest challenge we had last year was reaching the public and informing the public and making sure that we didn't leave anybody behind. Today's a good example. We're doing this virtually, right? In normal times, I'd be speaking to y'all in an audience, and I'd be going around the state speaking to audiences and sharing information and getting in the newspaper and so forth. And it's not just me, it's the governor, it's all of us that are kind of in a box. It's really hard to communicate to the public and go out and reach the people that you might miss otherwise. What we saw especially in the primary was we saw a really high utilization of new voting options in the urban areas because they were getting the information about how to do it.
Yeah.
You saw more use of absentee and early voting in Jefferson and Fayette and Franklin and Northern Kentucky to some extent than you saw in the rural areas. And we saw especially with the minority communities and in the rural areas, they weren't utilizing it as much. And I think some of that was cultural, but I think most of it was just lack of information. So I actually hired a staffer full-time to work on this problem, to reach out to African-American communities, to work with rural communities. So one thing we did is we put together how to vote flyers, and we distributed them through Meals on Wheels. My grandmother she lives in Livingston County, Kentucky. I'm from Western Kentucky. She's a shut-in. My grandfather passed away a couple decades ago. She's a shut-in, lives in a trailer in Livingston County, doesn't have much contact with the outside world, especially in COVID.
Yeah.
And I thought about, how do I reach people like my grandmother?
Yeah.
It's tough.
Yeah.
And so Meals on Wheels was one thing we did. And so I'm really proud that we thought of this. Unfortunately, we still saw some differences in the outcomes, but we did a better job in the general, knowing the problems that we had seen in the primary. We actually saw a more equitable use of these voting options in the general election. We saw a much higher rate of early and absentee voting with these communities in the general. And part of it was we learned from our mistakes and oversights, and we got better at it. But to your point, this has to be automatically built into the thought process of any government program. How do you make it fair in its administration, but also how do you make sure people know about it?
Yeah. Because I think, am I correct that last year was the first election that we had automatically restored voting rights to former felons?
It wasn't the first. This is an issue you all and I probably agree on. What we've seen is kind of a poor approach of going back and forth depending on who the governor is, dictates whether people get to vote or not. You had Governor Patton, who restored rights. Governor Fletcher didn't. Governor Beshear restored rights. Governor Bevin didn't. New Governor Beshear restores rights. I think we need a constitutional amendment and just pick the policy and set it and make it permanent versus going back and forth depending on the party of the governor. But to your point, yeah, we did have Governor Beshear come in on his third day of office, restored rights to convicted felons so they could vote.
And thinking back to your point about Meals on Wheels made me think not only to communities of color, but to those rural communities. Are there something that you would ask for, and maybe this is what your new staffer would ask for, but is there something within communities that can be done in terms of getting the word out about voting options, getting the word out about hey, your rights may have been automatically restored, you can register, because it's not that burden does not fall on you alone or even your office alone. So is there something you would ask of communities or of volunteers, advocates, anything like that, in getting that out and getting out that message?
Yeah, a couple of things. Number one, I think if we do expand voting beyond just one day, part of this will fix itself. If there's just one day to vote and people miss that one day, they don't get to vote. If you've got days or even a week or more of voting, you're going to have higher turnout. You're not going to have as many communities left behind because they're going to have greater notice and awareness that there's an election going on, and then a likelihood of them voting increases. So I think that's part of the solution, is just to have a better policy enacted. But in terms of getting that message out, we really saw a big problem here with felons being notified that they were eligible. And part of this is just the nature of the problem. They actually have to go to the governor's office and confirm that they are included within the order, because the order doesn't list the names of the people. Obviously, it's a blanket document, and to find out if you qualify under the terms of that order, you have to go to the governor's office and find out, and it gets very specific. So unfortunately, it's not really possible for these organizations to inform people that you qualify. All they can really do is raise awareness about, hey, there's a new order and you may qualify. Call this number for the governor's office and they can walk you through it and tell you.
But that sounds like that is going to be something that's going to require a whole lot more people than just you. I think, you know, your point about all the early voting options and just the modifications, I think the research tells us that those typically help like lower income folks or communities of color, or I would say, I don't know, I've not read the research on this, but like rural areas that have, you know, more just travel time. But what you're talking about sounds also kind of like a cultural change and a community, you know, community level change to get the word out on that. So, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised that in November we actually saw, to a degree that really shocked me, acceptance and approval of some of the voting options that had been controversial before. We saw a lot of Republicans vote by mail, despite what they were hearing in the national environment. They actually took advantage of Kentucky. They trusted our system, and a lot of them voted early in person. There's kind of a traditional viewpoint that elections are supposed to look a certain way and we shouldn't change it, and we changed it in pretty short order in a pretty radical way. And Republicans and Democrats both took advantage of it. Rural areas and urban areas both took advantage of it. And that's why I'm actually pretty optimistic that we can get this made permanent through legislation. Look, if this were just seen as a Democratic idea, there's no way the legislature would pass it. But
100%.
Republican legislators are hearing from Republican primary voters that they like this stuff. And if they don't, then it's got no shot.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does help everyone. Like this is, you know, to your point. Yeah, this is not a niche. Those improvements are not niche improvements. They're everybody improvements. So.
Let me give you an interesting statistic. I'm kind of a political nerd, and I looked this stuff up just to give you some perspective. In 2019, when I was on the ballot, we had 42% turnout in the general election. 42%. The Republican candidates for Attorney General, Commissioner of Agriculture, Treasurer, and Auditor all got 58% of the vote. In 2020, a year later, we had 65% turnout, from 42 to 65% turnout. Senator McConnell got 58% of the vote. What that shows you is when you make voting easier, you don't help Democrats, you don't help Republicans, you just help working people vote. And how they vote is how they vote. But you don't steal the election for Democrats or Republicans by making it easier for people to vote. The results came out pretty much the same. So I think people have to keep that in mind. I'm not trying to change the rules to help my side or the other side. I'm just trying to help working people vote. And I think the fact that the results kind of came out the same probably helps our chances of getting this made permanent, because it's not seen as an advantage to one side or the other. It's something the Democrats and Republicans can both support.
That rings so true for what we've been saying all week, that kids are common ground, that like kids are not a partisan issue. Kids, doing what we can for kids is something we should all come together for. And that, you know, like it's not a zero-sum game. And what you're talking about is like, this is not a zero-sum game, right? It just lets all of us do more instead of taking from one or another. And I think that's hopefully a similar perspective to what advocates on the call and all of our state leaders are thinking about when it comes to policies for kids, that, you know, this is better for the entire Commonwealth, not just some piece of it. So as we wrap up, I know we just have a few more minutes. We have some young people who are watching today and some young people who are going to be watching this recording. So what advice or encouragement would you give to them, whether they're, you know, about to be voters or whether they're still a few years from it, other than watching C-SPAN. Is there any kind of advice or anything or encouragement that you would like to impart upon them?
Well, I'd say the same thing I say to my own daughter. She's 14. Find your passion, and if you're a parent, help your kid find your kid's passion. I'm totally different from my family. They really weren't that political, and to the degree they were for the other side than me. But they respected that I really cared about politics and really cared about my viewpoints, and they were like, okay, well, great, run with it. How can we help? What can we introduce you to? I'd say that the thing in my life that's made the most difference of anything is we were pretty poor, but my dad always made sure that if I wanted a book, I got that book. And I've got a lot of books about government and politics, and I used what I learned when I was 16, 17 years old reading those books. I use it today, and it made a difference in my life and my career, and hopefully made a difference, for other people in their lives last year too. So a little goes a long way. My kid has no interest in politics. I'm actually a little bit relieved by that on some level, but she's still figuring out what her passion is, and whatever it is, it'll be the right answer.
That's awesome. That feels like such a good, I don't know, like parting message, but I didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to the advocates on the call today, or anything else before we wrapped up, if you wanted to do any kind of benediction for everyone.
Well, I would add to that, if your passion is public policy, if it's youth advocates issues or other issues for that matter, you're needed. The people who drive policy in our state nationally are the people who are active. And sometimes the messages that people in a public office like me get don't reflect the reality of what people actually think writ large. The vast majority of the public agree with everything that the governor and I did last year, but I mostly heard from people who were against it. And they were pretty opinionated and pretty loud about it. That can be in your favor if you're taking a position people disagree with. Just go out and be active. But also, there's a real need for people who are not the usual suspects when it comes to protesting and so forth to get out there and be heard. It's easy to get lost in the mix. The special interest groups, they get heard plenty, and people give them a lot of running room because they're active and they take up so much room. But there's also a big place for people who aren't the usual suspects to be heard, and people like me really need to hear that. We get a refracted view of reality because we only hear from the far right or the far left all the time, and people in the center who have common sense solutions, they just get missed a lot. So I want to encourage everyone, whatever your views are, go out there and push them. Voting is great. It's the beginning of the process. Do other stuff too.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful sentiment, that there's so many folks who are just trying to do the right thing. It's not their interest or whatever that they're for whatever it is that they are passionate about. They are just trying to make that happen. All right, I know you have to go, and I'm sorry to see you go, but thank you so much, Secretary Adams, for spending time with us today, spending time with the advocates today. You, I think, have been just a wonderful state leader during these difficult times, and such a wonderful example that I hope other states are looking at. And I hope that a lot of members of our Commonwealth, a lot of Kentuckians admire you as much as I do. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Jessie. That's very gracious. Something I'm real proud of is I'm in actually the middle of a nationwide conference of secretaries of state, and they're asking me, "What's your special sauce? How did you run elections in Kentucky?" And it's not because we did one or two or three policies right. It's because we did it in a way that was fair and inclusive. And that's, I think, a real important thing for all of us in government to remember is you got to be fair and inclusive, and go out of your way to listen and find people that aren't included to make sure that everyone gets a seat at the table. Yeah. Otherwise, you won't have credibility.
Right. And no matter what you're working on, you won't have credibility for any of that. All right, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much. And I hope that we get to have you back again sometime soon.
I'd be delighted. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everyone.